Well, thank you everybody for staying with us today, some of you all day. I hope you've enjoyed these presentations as much as I know our curatorial team all has. We're very excited. Our final presentation of the day is by Euler Wu Collaborative, an architecture design firm in Los Angeles led by Dwayne Oyler and Jenny Wu, that approaches architecture and design with a critical and rigorous intent that challenges the typical vision of the built environment. Recent projects include a 3D printing showroom and office space for 3DS Culinary in Hollywood, California, the Storm Cloud Pavilion for SciArc's 40th anniversary event, the winning pavilion entry for the Beijing Biennale, and a 16-story residential tower in Taipei, Taiwan. The office has won numerous awards, including the Design Vanguard Award from Architectural Record, the Emerging Talent Award from AIA California Council, the Presidential Honor Award for Emerging Practice from AIA LA, Taiwan's ADA Award for Emerging Architects, and the Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League in New York. Welcome.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here. At the risk of sounding like a brown-noser, I wanted to say, because I haven't really had a chance to say to Columbus, I know they're not judging. I'm from a Midwestern town, about the quarter size of Columbus. And we hadn't been to Columbus before. It was especially incredible to come to see the investment of the community and the commitment to design. I've spent a lot of years going back to my hometown frustrated about the role of design, which is absolutely zero. And I think that the commitment to it here points a way forward for so many places that don't recognize its value. So it really has been inspiring to see. Okay. When we found out that we got the Saarinen building, I got to say we were thrilled. There are very few architects that we make direct reference to in things like lectures. We really admire the work of Saarinen. And it is largely because he, at a time when everyone else was working, when all of their work really existed within a kind of purist modernism, he was a guy who really charted his own course. And as Ben pointed out, while he didn't have a single style that he worked within, there were a set of principles that guided the work. And there were kind of veins of work that existed formally, spatially, and tectonically throughout his work. I think that Columbus had a similar love for Saarinen. 3 of his really important projects exist here: the Union Bank, our site, obviously, as well as the Miller House and the North Christian Church. And in many ways, you could say these represent what, in terms of the built work, is a kind of evolution of his work, from a relatively pure modernist work to things that were more extravagant formally and that pushed the interests in more extravagant ways, shall we say. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. So, as has been pointed out, this is our site. There's the bank. These are what came a little bit later than the time the bank was built, but ultimately became the banking tellers, the drive-through tellers. You would pull in here, you'd drive up to these tellers and communicate with a person inside and then drive back out. Since these have been converted just to a series of 3 canopies in the park and a green space that is located here. So the space that we were allowed to operate within was both the green space, as Ben operated in, as well as the courtyard itself. And we really immediately were drawn to the canopies and thought about the way to take advantage of the potential of the fact that they already exist. It's very easy when you first view the bank to think, oh, it belongs to that moment of modernism in its purity, in its relationship to similar buildings of the time. Here's Mises Crown Hall, designed in the same year, but the bank was ultimately built a little bit later, as well as the Philip Johnson Glass House. But if you look a little bit closer at the Union Bank, there are some anomalies going on here that I think point to Mises' interests that begin to develop a little bit later in his career. Saarinen. It's often said that the relationship of these domes, that the form of these domes came out of the honey locust that exists throughout Indiana. And the role of them really really taking on the idea of this voided honey locust, as though they somehow exist within the space, but in voided form. And this idea of the implied object in a space was something that we saw throughout his work, and we tried to, but especially in this building, and we tried to build upon. An interesting trick that Saarinen often played, he had a really incredible way to think about the relationship between structure and light, things that in many ways exist in different realms, one having the ability to communicate very poetically, and the other one often dismissed as a kind of engineering exercise. What you see increasingly in his work later from a formal standpoint, so if you go to Dulles Airport, you get this trick of the structure reaching up through a hole, coming back down and suspending the roof. But not only does it pull that kind of strict structurally of a kind of look, mom, no hands, you're also getting light moving down into the space, which further accentuates that idea. Here also you're seeing some of his later work, at least the built later work. The arch was actually designed in the late 40s and built much later, almost 14 years later. But here in this later work, you're especially seeing a move toward much more complex geometry. And we tried to think of the work. We weren't especially interested in replicating his geometries, but we did want to acknowledge that he very much evolved, and his interest in complex geometries gained a lot more esteem as he evolved. So here are these slides that emphasize that idea of light moving through. The moment that you expect structural forces to move down to the ground, that's the moment when he opens up the building and allows light to move down into it. So you can see that probably starting on the right, probably most obvious in the Dulles Airport project with the columns that move up through the roof. But you can also see it in the Miller House where the columns go up, and there is the diagonal cruciform column with a skylight above. There's a skylight just above there that's allowing light to come in, again, right at that moment you expect forces to move down to the ground. I think you could also argue that in the Union Bank, there is just the seed of that kind of interest happening in these domes, where you get this mysterious light coming from the hanging fixture moving up into the dome, the goal being really about not just lighting the space from the standpoint of brightness, but trying to lighten the sense of the space above. He had a very different tectonic that was often apparent in the smaller, more intimate elements of the building. Most apparent in this kind of stair that he kept making that employed these smaller filigree linear elements. It was as though the building was always a pure abstract thing, but when you moved into the building, the idea was to really hang all of these stairs and for them to be made up of much smaller elements that were much more appropriately scaled to the human body, things you could touch, you could grab, and again, that gave a sense of suspension and lightness. So there were really three issues that we wanted to look at. The first is, within his work, there was always in the beginning of these early projects, and especially in Union Bank, an interest in beginning with the very simple Euclidean geometry, a basic box. And we looked to those three canopies and thought, how do we use those to essentially imply a single unified element? Secondly, we were interested in that idea of the implied object, taking from the honey locusts, the voided domes, and we thought about how we might make use of moves that built on that idea of an object existing both as a solid within the space and as a void, a kind of absence of an object. And finally, we wanted to make use of this tectonic idea of more filigree elements that play some role in the sense of porosity of the piece, in trying to lighten it up, and to add shadows that help to accentuate the spatial experience of the piece. So the first move, again, was to think about the role of those three canopies and unifying each of them. And again, the solid-void relationship and tectonic relationships. Let's hope this animation works. So I just want to walk you through how we were thinking about the formation of the scheme. So first you have the three canopies, again, existing on the site. And we started thinking, how do we begin conceptually by thinking about this as one single unified whole? We then, rather than relying on an absolute complete whole, trying to balance the idea that you were going to occupy this, and we wanted it not to be read as completely as an object, but as an implied whole, we then thought of that solid as existing as two L-shaped pieces that defined every corner, but still allowed for some movement and porosity through the piece. Did that play? No. We then wanted to introduce that idea of the more filigree element like you're seeing in Saarinen's stairs, and we wanted to oppose these two opposite walls using primarily a different tectonic, so that one remains a solid opaque wall, and the other becomes a more translucent or porous wall. Then each of them would get an element placed within them. And finally, then we wanted to create a series of voids and erasures that happened within each of the walls, within which those objects would float freely, so that you get light moving down in the cracks of each one. So there, again, you start with the basic solid wall, you introduce a void, and then within that void there's an object placed. The idea being that there is a very loose fit relationship, like the relationship of the column in Dulles Airport, that allows light to move down in the cracks and kind of mysteriously emerge within the scheme. This just gives you some sense of the sectional relationships going on in the piece. So I was talking about that idea of the loose fit. So what happens within each of these walls, regardless of whether or not they are a porous wall or a solid wall, is you're getting these objects that are kind of suspended in the walls, and you would get light moving through each one of them, but not necessarily allowing for direct vision through them. And this gives you much more a sense of the qualitative aspects of those, where you not only get light moving through each of them, say in a place like that or that, there's also the production and multiplication of the filigree elements through shadows.
So here are some sections through our project, and in this case, you really understand the kind of loose fit of the embedded object, whether it's solid or more filigree frame, and how that has these kind of cracks and allows you to see light in. Also, you can still start to see how some of these objects become actual elements that you can sit in. So there are benches, as well as, and once we started doing this kind of erasure, how much of the frame do we need to keep so that we can still hold the idea of the implied volume of the overall box? Here's a plan of our project, and you can kind of first you understand the kind of reversal from kind of a solid wall to the flip side, which is a framed wall. And then I think what's also really important to see in the plan is that you know, at the end of the day, we've been talking a lot about kind of architectural ideas, but what we're really interested is how this can start to activate the space, and that, you know, incorporating existing benches and how this might actually make a place and not just something that you look at from the outside, but something you actually occupy. Sort of elevations. So first look at the just kind of front elevation, and what you see along Fifth Street is this kind of solid wall, and you'll see this kind of here, this is one of the existing canopy, here's the other existing canopy, and then this embedded object, you start to see the hint of this this frame element starting to move back, and how that might become something in the back, but you don't quite understand it yet. here is of that corner. And I think it was really important for us to actually make the L shape because it defines it as an overall volume. And then the experience of being inside. I think some of the earlier ideas that Dwayne was talking about this kind of mysterious light, the idea that we use this kind of loose fit of the object within the wall and allow this kind of filigree frame to cast shadows, and then the light cracks through. And you know, so it's not, the relationship is not so obvious. Dwayne's gonna quickly flip the model so you see the other side. So as you kind of round the corner, on this corner view, you start to see the kind of two L shape making the overall volume, and you can see them in relation to each other. One, this kind of lightly filigree frame that wraps around, and some pieces comes down and becomes a bench element. And then this is the view from interior of the courtyard, where you really start to see this kind of the juxtaposition of the two solid void relationship and how one becomes the other and then kind of reverses itself. And there's just that kind of relationship of seeing the buildings through this frame or being blocked by the frame, and then kind of reverses the other way. And I mean, I think the idea is that we hope to really activate the plaza itself. And there were a few other ways we're doing that. So initially, as we were mentioning about the kind of, you know, taking advantage of the existing canopy and, you know, using these kind of two L-shaped walls to imply the overall volume of this, this block. We actually think that that strategy would also help if we can activate the overall plaza and not just that block itself. So we actually want to extend elements of this project into a few other places. So here in this corner, to kind of capture the larger space of the interior courtyard, and then actually extend another element by Jackson, and then allows you to have a kind of even bigger understanding of the impact of the project. And we also think about how we could work on the kind of landscaping of the greenery to potentially create kind of a view corridor, or even potentially a pedestrian corridor that connects you while you're walking down Jackson to see this piece, and then allows you to kind of move into the plaza.
If you go there now, there's actually no green on the space, but when we were here in September, there were very tall plants planted along the perimeter. So we like the idea that those come back, but without that strip that aligns with our piece.
And, you know, we were just imagining if this was a very wintry day. Very. You actually see one of the elements really in the far corner, and then the kind of hint of another element, and how all three of these things start to tie the entire plaza together. And kind of zooming in.
We wanted to talk a little bit about the feasibility of the project. Maybe we'll start just by talking about what the materials are. We're imagining the entire piece is out of steel at the moment, but it is a mixture of steel depending on the specific conditions. The smaller linear pieces would be tube steel, primarily 3/8" tube steel contained within larger elements that are 1" tube steel. The solid pieces are a combination of things depending on the condition. So the larger walls would probably be a steel frame, with the pieces that could be painted and riveted being a paint galvanized paint-ready material. The pieces that are more elaborate and curvilinear would probably have to be a mild steel to allow for continuous welding that would then be painted with the best paint we could find. But you know, we're concerned about the rusting, so anywhere we could possibly use a paint-ready galvanized or have it powder-coated, that's what we would do. We wanted to show a handful of projects very quickly just to give a sense of the kind of scale and level of complexity that we're used to working at. We, like Ball and Nogus, also build the majority of our work, or all of the work that's been at this scale. We're especially skilled in building these kind of jigs that allow for these types of geometries. So this is a piece approximately 25-foot square that was done entirely out of aluminum, slightly larger sections, but 100% aluminum in this case. This is one that was a mild steel, and it was up for about 3 years that was painted without any real rust problems. Another one in the bottom left that's made of aluminum. This one with an extremely elaborate form, and a jig was constructed first in order to allow that to happen. And another one, the more we did these, the more it became important to us to build them in a way that was disassemblable. Our long-term strategy is really to build something that can be disassembled and reassembled somewhere else. We think that, frankly, all of these have so much effort into them that the idea of making them disposable or go away after 3 months shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be to make things that are worthy of keeping long-term. So that would be our hope. So this gives an example of one where we made it disassemblable. This was built in Los Angeles. It occupied a site at SCI-Arc for about a year, and it's now on a mountain in Utah. And probably the closest in terms of the types of geometry and material that we're proposing is one that we completed about a year ago. This was done using a combination of analog, old school manual bending, and some CNC bending that we had outsourced. All of this is built in the back workspace of our own office. This one was 100% welded by me. So it's something that we're quite capable of doing. This was also built, it was built in place as a single piece. It was then chopped and elements were kind of doubled up to allow for through bolting. That would be our plan with this as well, is to arrive in trucks. This thing bolts together in hopefully a day or two. Yeah. And we just wanted to end on this one image of the backside of it, where you really get a sense of these pieces moving through, solid pieces moving through the more filigree elements, operating in opposition to the piece in the background. Thank you.
What do you say the material is for the solid pieces, the solid objects?
There would be a lightweight steel frame with sheet metal over them that's painted, and those would probably be riveted to that frame. And they would be put together in ways that would allow us, for example, to arrive with a piece that is not, so this piece is, for example, not yet riveted to the frame. We bring it, we put the frame together, and then we cap back over it and rivet it in place to complete the...
Okay. And same construction for the two solid pieces embedded on this side?
These would probably, these would be a mild steel that are a combination of folded when we could and continuously welded when they're not. So they'd be laser cut mild steel that is then welded and painted.
Can you talk a little bit about the process of generating these forms? What were their sort of conditions that how they came about?
The simple answer to that is we brought that from our own work. When we looked at the work that happened around Columbus, and we think that architects were at their best when they brought their own interest on some level, but were respectful to the conditions on others. There is a shared similarity, I think, with some of Saarinen's work, but the goal here wasn't to copy or sample anything he did. It was we brought that interest that happened to be shared.
I think we were also interested in kind of if you look at even this model, the kind of, in some ways, the oddness of a dome in this kind of box building, and something that, would really play the contrast between, the rectangular volume and the kind of erasure, the voided objects, and yes, we took some from our own geometry, but also what kind of geometry would really play up that contrast.
Yeah, we couldn't take, they needed to be, in order to create these things that would create voids and would skim the surface and do certain things, the kind of geometry that we worked with, it had to have very particular qualities that in order to make that happen.
Could you comment on the decision to put the more opaque wall on one side of the site versus the other, urbanistically and
sure.
specifically?
When we noticed that when we were on the site, so if the courtyard operates like this, and there's a pathway at the back. We found that in general, very few people were coming this way and walking into the building here. The majority of them were walking into the park and cutting that way. So it was really about leaving this end open and this end marking the object. We also didn't want a sense if you were using this space, that this didn't have a level of porosity that was inviting. So it was important to us, if you're coming from here or if you're in the building, that you could see all the way through it.
Yeah, and then also even for the actual building here, the office building here, we didn't want to be kind of blocking that, and so we made the kind of face on this corner.
Yeah, the balance of the idea of containment was super important here. Like we wanted it to feel, on one hand, kind of perceptually contained, but we didn't want it to feel like you had to enter into an object.
Just quickly, what is the scale? Like this kind of arched opening, and then you have sort of another doorway over there.
The goal here was 6'8". This is about 10 feet, but it varies because there's a little bit of slope in this direction that's not on the site.
Just a experiential question. It doesn't touch the ground very much. It's very lightweight, with the exception of the bench that is coming down here. Did you consider the ground as having any significance with your work here? In terms of, I'm thinking of patterning that's inside the bank. I think you referenced that. Just curious.
Right. I don't know that I have a good answer for that.
Yeah, I think one of the kind of mandates where we weren't kind of supposed to like put anything on the existing building, so we were kind of careful not to have to do that. Mm-hmm. But I think, I would think that there were some we would think about how we would do that.
Yeah, we were thinking more about the level of the existing benches than we were about the actual ground plane.
Right, like the canopies and the existing benches, how to incorporate that.
Yeah.
So from inside the bank, your view out now, with the solid wall, was that facing west there? What do you think the view of the park is now with the structure in place?
We think from the doors you're gonna see the pavilion. We felt like the majority, because the rest of the bank and the other building still allows for that. We felt like it was kind of okay that within that view it was mostly through our pavilion.
And I think what we were trying not to do is, it felt a little bit like the courtyard was kind of a place people cross but don't stay. So we were really careful about trying to make a place that people would actually stay and activate the space, so that, even if it's solid only in this L shape, I think it already makes a place that people will want to stay in, and for the shading and all that. So.
Thank you.